The heavy winter rain lashed against the towering glass windows of the Winter Palace, but inside the great banquet hall, the silence was absolute. 200 nobles held their breath. The air thick with the scent of beeswax candles, and roasted venison felt suddenly suffocating. Beneath the massive crystal chandeliers, the music had stopped abruptly. There was only the sound of high-borne boots shifting nervously on the cold marble floor, waiting for the storm to break. At the center of the hall stood Grand Duchess Seraphina. She wore a heavy, emerald gown of state corseted so tightly it made her ribs ache. Her dark auburn hair was pinned flawlessly above her graceful neck. She did not tremble. She did not lower her head. Her spine was straight as a sword blade, even as the eyes of the entire kingdom burned into her with silent accusation. 3 steps above her, standing before the sovereign's throne, was her husband. Sovereign Grand Duke Alexander of Valerius was a man forged from duty and cold authority. Tall, imposing, and dressed in a midnight blue velvet coat, embroidered with the silver crest of his house, he looked down at her. His deep-set storm-grey eyes were devoid of the tentative warmth they had shared just a week ago. Tonight they were filled with the ice of betrayal. In his gloved hand he gripped a stack of parchment. "Treason," Alexander said. His voice was not a shout. It was measured quiet and ruthlessly formal. Yet it echoed against the stone pillars like a physical blow. He raised his hand and let the letters fall. The heavy parchment pages scattered down the marble throne steps, landing at Seraphina's feet. The deep red wax seals gleamed under the candlelight like fresh blood. "Letters bearing your signature, Seraphina." Alexander continued, his jaw locking so tightly the muscles flickered beneath his fair skin. "Letters detailing a conspiracy to surrender the eastern borders to our enemies. Letters written to the man who now kneels before this court, claiming to be your accomplice." Seraphina's hazel eyes shifted marginally toward the man kneeling a few feet away. He was a stranger, bruised and trembling, a hired actor playing the role of a desperate lover and co-conspirator. "I beg for mercy, your grace," the man wept, casting a pathetic glance toward Seraphina. "The Grand Duchess promised me sanctuary. She swore that once the Duke was out of the way, the House of Vance would rise again." A collective gasp swept through the nobles. Whispers ignited like dry brush catching fire. "Her father's blood runs in her veins." "A traitor's daughter, what did the sovereign expect? To think she almost wore the crown of Valerius." Standing halfway in the shadows behind the throne, Baroness Isabella of Rinaldi pressed a silk handkerchief to her lips. Her platinum blonde curls perfectly framed her narrow, angular face. Her pale green eyes widened in an immaculate display of feigned horror, but Seraphina, who had spent months learning the venom of this court, saw the sharp, calculating smirk hidden behind the lace. Seraphina looked back up at Alexander. Her chest tightened, the corset pressing against her lungs. She had been forced into this marriage as a treaty to clear her father's disgraced name. She had endured the isolation, the whispers, and the coldness of her new husband, hoping that logic and loyalty would eventually win his trust. But Alexander's fatal flaw was his fear of betrayal. He had inherited a kingdom fractured by deceit, and he would always choose state security over emotional faith. "Do you have nothing to say?" Alexander demanded, gripping the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The silver sovereign signet ring on his finger flashed under the light. "Will you not even attempt to deny the ink on these pages?" "And if I deny it, your grace," Seraphina's voice rang out, calm and painfully steady, "will you believe me?" Alexander froze. For a fraction of a second, the coldness in his eyes cracked, revealing the agonizing doubt of a man who did not want to destroy his wife, but felt the chains of his crown forcing his hand. But the hesitation vanished as quickly as it appeared. The court was watching. The law demanded action. "You were meant to unite this realm," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a harsh private octave that only she could hear over the rain. "Instead, you are a burden to this crown, a burden I can no longer afford to bear." The words struck her harder than a physical blow. "A burden. Guards," Alexander commanded, turning his back to her. "Confine the Grand Duchess to the East Wing. She is to be stripped of her court privileges until the council convenes for her sentencing at dawn." 2 palace guards in silver armor stepped forward immediately. One of them, eager to prove his loyalty, roughly grabbed Seraphina's upper arm. The sudden force threw her off balance. Her heavy emerald skirt caught under her own heel, and with a sharp, sickening sound, the silk hem tore. The sound of the tearing fabric silenced the room once more. It was the ultimate visual degradation the regal Grand Duchess manhandled, like a common criminal, her dignity literally ripping at the seams. Seraphina stopped. She did not try to pull her arm away. She slowly turned her head and looked at the guard holding her. Her hazel eyes were so incredibly calm, so terrifyingly authoritative, that the guard's breath hitched. He instinctively loosened his grip. She adjusted her posture, refusing to look down at her ruined hem. But as she took a measured step backward to turn away, her gaze caught one of the letters, resting on the floor by her shoe, the red wax seal. Seraphina stared at it for a fleeting heartbeat. She knew the royal seal of Valerius perfectly. She had spent hours studying crown laws in the archives. The true seal featured the Valerian eagle with its talons clutching 3 arrows. On the wax staring up at her, the eagle held 3 arrows, but the middle arrow lacked the microscopic feathering at its base. It was a flaw invisible to anyone who had not spent their childhood tracing royal documents with their father. It was a forgery, a brilliant, expensive forgery. She subtly slid her gloved hand into the deep pocket of her emerald gown, her fingers wrapping around the cold, cracked surface of her father's old pocket watch. The watch that held a secret key. Isabella wanted to play a game of royal documents. Very well, Seraphina thought, the cold marble freezing her feet through her slippers. Let them lock me away. She raised her chin, looking at Alexander's broad, unmoving back one last time before turning and walking out of the great banquet hall. Her back was perfectly straight. Her torn hem dragged across the stone floor with a soft, sweeping sound that the court would not easily forget. The true sovereign had just left the room, and they had until dawn to realize it. The heavy oak door of the east wing confinement room shut with a hollow, echoing thud. The iron deadbolt slid into place with a metallic scrape that finalized her isolation. Seraphina stood in the center of the dim chamber. The air here was bitter and stale, devoid of the warmth of the roaring hearths in the great banquet hall. Outside the narrow iron-latticed windows, the winter rain continued its relentless assault against the glass, blurring the distant lights of the kingdom she was supposed to rule. She did not collapse onto the narrow, dust-covered bed in the corner. She did not weep. Slowly, methodically, she unclasped the heavy velvet cloak. A sympathetic guard had draped over her shoulders in the corridor, and laid it neatly over a wooden chair. Looking down, she stared at the torn hem of her emerald state gown. The ragged silk dragged pitifully against the cold floorboards. In the royal court, a torn garment was a symbol of a fallen house. They expected her to unravel, to shatter under the weight of Alexander's public rejection. Instead, Seraphina slid her gloved hand back into her deep pocket and pulled out the cracked pocket watch. The brass casing was cold, tarnished by time. The glass face was fractured into a spiderweb pattern, the hands forever frozen at 3 minutes past midnight. It was the only item she had been allowed to keep when her father, the former Duke Vance, was stripped of his titles and exiled to the borderlands 3 years ago. Her thumb traced the jagged crack in the glass. The sensory memory pulled her back to the night her father had given it to her. The court does not kill with swords, Seraphina. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, tired and ragged as he packed his few remaining possessions. They kill with ink and wax. The House of Rinaldi has built its fortune on documents that appear out of nowhere. They forge the truth so perfectly that reality itself becomes a lie. He had pressed the broken watch into her palm, his fingers trembling. There is a flaw in their perfection, little bird. They cannot replicate history. Keep this safe. Do not open it until the wolves are at your door. The wolves were not just at her door tonight. They had invited her to the banquet and offered her as the main course. The sound of approaching footsteps in the stone corridor snapped her back to the present. The footsteps were too light, too measured to belong to a palace guard. The iron deadbolt scraped open. The door groaned inward. Baroness Isabella of Rinaldi stepped into the cold room, bringing the suffocating scent of jasmine perfume with her. Her gold-laced silk gown caught the dim light of the single candle flickering on the wall, a stark, deliberate contrast to Seraphina's dark, torn emerald dress. Isabella signaled for the 2 guards to remain in the hallway, and quietly pulled the heavy door shut behind her. "It is freezing in here," Isabella murmured, wrapping a pristine white fur shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked around the barren room with a theatrical sigh. "I told the sovereign that this was too cruel a punishment for a woman of your delicate upbringing, but he would not be moved. He is terribly angry, Seraphina." Seraphina did not invite her to sit. She remained standing by the window, her posture unbroken, her hands folded neatly before her. Did you come all this way in the rain, Baroness, simply to discuss the draft in this room? Seraphina asked, her voice an elegant, icy whisper. Isabella's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She stepped closer, her pale green eyes scanning Seraphina for any sign of tears, any tremor of fear. Finding none, her smile sharpened into a blade. I came to offer my sympathies, Isabella said softly, circling Seraphina like a hawk appraising wounded prey. By dawn, the council will convene. Alexander has already ordered the scribes to draft a decree of exile, or perhaps, considering the gravity of treason, the execution order. It is a tragedy, really. You tried so hard to wear a crown that was entirely too heavy for you. The crown is not heavy, Isabella, Seraphina replied evenly. It is the lies required to steal it that break a person's neck. Isabella stopped pacing. The feigned sweetness evaporated from her face, leaving behind a raw, grasping ambition. Your father spoke in riddles. Too, right before he was thrown out of the capital. It seems the Vance bloodline shares a talent for pathetic delusions. The letters are sealed Seraphina. The actor has confessed. Alexander looked at you and saw exactly what I wanted him to see, a traitor. A burden. Seraphina absorbed the word, burden, without flinching. Alexander's words in Isabella's mouth felt dirty, but they also confirmed what she already knew. Isabella was overconfident. She believed the forged letters were flawless. She believed the sovereign was completely under her manipulation. A beautifully constructed lie. Seraphina conceded, her tone infuriatingly conversational. But you made one mistake, Baroness. Isabella narrowed her eyes. Oh, and what would that be? You assumed I would beg him to believe me, Seraphina said, turning her hazel eyes directly onto Isabella. The sheer weight of a true Grand Duchess's authority radiated from her gaze, cold and ancient. You assumed I would kneel in the dirt and plead for my husband's mercy, but I am not my father, Isabella, and I do not beg. For a moment the silence in the room was louder than the rain. Isabella's jaw tightened. She had expected a broken, sobbing girl. She had wanted to savor the taste of Seraphina's despair. Instead, she was looking at a woman who seemed to be waiting for a trap to close. Enjoy your pride while you still have a head to hold it up. Isabella sneered, her composure slipping. She turned sharply toward the door. At dawn, you will be nothing but a disgraced memory, and I will be standing beside the sovereign when he burns your name from the archives. Isabella knocked twice on the heavy wood. The guards opened the door and she swept out into the corridor, her gold silk rustling like dry leaves. The deadbolt slammed shut once more. Seraphina was alone again. She took a slow, measured breath, feeling the ache in her ribs subside. Isabella was right about one thing: by dawn the council would demand blood. Alexander, blinded by his duty to protect the state, would sign the decree. She did not have time to wait for a miracle. She did not have time to hope her husband would magically realize the truth. Seraphina raised the cracked pocket watch to the candlelight. With deliberate force, she pressed her thumb against the fractured glass face and pushed. The glass shattered inward with a sharp crunch, slicing through the silk of Seraphina's right glove. A thin line of crimson welled up, staining the white fabric, but she did not stop. With meticulous care, she peeled away the broken shards of the pocket watch face. Beneath the frozen brass hands lay the intricate, unmoving gears of a timepiece that had not ticked in over 3 years. She pressed her thumb against the center gear, turning it counterclockwise exactly 3 times, just as her father had showed her in the dim light of his study before the royal guards had come to drag him away. With a soft metallic click, the backplate of the watch popped open. Resting inside a velvet-lined hollow was a tiny, intricately carved brass key. Seraphina exhaled a quiet breath. She slipped the key out, its cold edges pressing into the cut on her palm. She turned her attention to the far corner of the confinement room. When the sovereign's guards had dragged her away from the great banquet hall, they had unceremoniously dumped her personal travel trunk into this miserable chamber, a silent declaration that her presence in the palace was temporary, her belongings already packed for exile. The heavy oak trunk was bound in iron, bearing the disgraced crest of the House of Vance. Dragging her torn emerald hem across the dusty floorboards, Seraphina knelt beside the trunk. She did not open the main latch. Instead, she ran her bleeding gloved hand along the bottom right iron band until she felt a nearly invisible indentation in the wood. She pressed the tiny brass key into the concealed hole and turned it. A false bottom dropped down with a quiet thud hitting the floorboards. Hidden within the narrow compartment was a single leather-bound journal. The leather was worn, smelling of old parchment, damp earth, and ink. It was the culmination of her father's desperate final years, the investigation that had cost him his reputation, his title, and ultimately his life in the borderlands. Seraphina carried the journal to the single flickering candle on the wall sconce. Her hands were remarkably steady as she untied the leather cord. She turned the brittle pages, her hazel eyes scanning her father's frantic, elegant handwriting. There were ledgers, names of corrupt ministers, and roots of black market gold. But she skipped past them, flipping toward the very end, searching for the weapon Isabella of Rinaldi had used tonight. The royal seal, she read, pausing on a page that contained a highly detailed, hand-drawn sketch of the Valerian eagle. The Rinaldi forge masters are artists of treason her father had written in the margins. They buy the exact red wax from the eastern merchants. They measure the weight of the sovereign's strike. Their counterfeit seal is flawless to the naked eye. But they do not know the secret of the Grand Duchy's founding. Seraphina leaned closer to the candlelight. When the first sovereign cast the master matrix of the royal seal, he intentionally struck the mold with a jeweler's chisel. The eagle clutches 3 arrows in its left talon. On the counterfeit, Rinaldi seals all 3 arrows are perfectly smooth, but on the true sovereign seal, the middle arrow has a microscopic jagged nick at its base, a flaw designed to outlive perfection. Only the sovereign and the high archivist know this truth. Seraphina closed her eyes, the sheer weight of the revelation pressing into her chest. She had seen the letters on the marble floor of the banquet hall. She had seen the perfectly smooth arrows. Isabella was using the flawless counterfeit seal, but a cold realization immediately followed. If Seraphina simply presented this journal to Alexander in the morning, he would not believe her. The sovereign Grand Duke was a man ruled by evidence deeply scarred by his fear of betrayal. To him, this journal was just the desperate scribbling of a convicted traitor, trying to clear his name. Isabella would simply claim the letters were real, and that Seraphina was inventing riddles to save her own head. No, pointing out the flaw was not enough. She needed Isabella to willingly use the forged seal right in front of the sovereign in a situation where she could not deny her ownership of it. To build that trap, Seraphina needed to know exactly how the Royal Archive recorded the seal's usage. She needed the official Crown Ledger, a book, kept strictly under lock and key in the Midnight Archive, a restricted vault deep beneath the Winter Palace. She looked up at the heavy, iron-bolted door. The silhouettes of the 2 guards were visible through the narrow gap beneath the wood. Dawn was approaching. In a few hours the council would convene to seal her fate. She could not wait for Alexander to come to his senses. She had to secure the ledger tonight. Seraphina turned away from the door and surveyed the cold, drafty room. This was the East Wing, the oldest section of the palace built during the reign of the first sovereign. The walls were thick, designed to withstand sieges, but they were also riddled with servant passages used to tend to the massive stone hearths without disturbing the royalty. She walked over to the blackened, unlit fireplace. The air here was colder, smelling of ancient soot and damp stone. She knelt, ignoring the ash that stained the torn hem of her emerald gown. She pressed her hands against the back wall of the hearth. Her fingers traced the mortar until she felt a deep groove. She pushed. With a low grinding sound, the heavy stone panel pivoted backward, revealing a pitch-black narrow corridor, meant for the ash sweepers. A freezing draft rushed out, extinguishing the single candle in her room. Swallowed by the darkness, Seraphina picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth. She was no longer a cast-out bride waiting for the executioner. She was the Grand Duchess of Valerius, and she was going to tear Isabella's perfect lie to the ground. Clutching her father's journal against her tight corset, Seraphina stepped into the hidden blackness, leaving her prison behind. The hidden ash passage was a suffocating throat of stone plunging down into the very foundations of the Winter Palace. Seraphina moved slowly in the pitch black. The air was thick with centuries of cold soot clinging to the sweat on her neck and the torn hem of her heavy emerald gown. The corseted bodice restricted her breathing, making every step a grueling effort, but the icy resolve burning in her chest pushed her forward. The cut on her right palm, sustained from the shattered watch glass, stung bitterly inside her ruined white glove. After what felt like an eternity of descending, steep, uneven steps, the narrow tunnel ended at a rusted iron grate. Through the iron bars, a faint ghostly moonlight filtered down from high barred windows. Seraphina pushed against the grate. With a harsh screech that made her wince, the old iron gave way. She stepped out of the wall and into the cavernous silence of the Midnight Archive. The vault was massive, a subterranean library of crown secrets. Towering oak shelves stretched into the shadows, groaning under the weight of leather-bound ledgers, ancient treaties, and the blood-soaked history of the Valyrian kings. The air here smelled of dried parchment, old wax, and absolute stillness. Seraphina did not waste a second. She moved silently across the cold stone floor toward the high archivist's desk at the center of the room. She did not need to steal the crown ledger. Her father's journal had already given her the knowledge of the seal's flaw. What she needed now were the tools to build a trap that Isabella of Rinaldi could not resist. She opened the heavy oak drawers of the desk, her bleeding hand leaving a faint crimson smudge on the wood. There it was. Resting in a velvet-lined tray were sheets of raw, unwritten royal parchment, the exact paper used for sovereign decrees, bearing the invisible watermark of the Valyrian eagle woven into the very fibers. Beside it sat a vial of the specialized iron gall ink, used only by the royal court. Seraphina carefully pulled one sheet of the thick parchment and folded it, slipping it, and the small ink vial, deep into the bodice of her gown, pressing them against the stiff boning of her corset. Suddenly a warm, flickering golden light bled into the aisles. Footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Seraphina froze. She pressed her back against the towering bookshelf, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. No guard had the authority to enter the Midnight Archive. "I know someone is there." A low, resonant voice echoed through the vault. It was Alexander. Seraphina closed her eyes, fighting to control her breathing. The Sovereign Grand Duke was here. She stepped out from the shadows of the aisle, standing in the center of the archive. Alexander stopped. He held a brass lantern in one hand, the golden light washing over his rigid face. He had stripped off his heavy velvet state coat. He wore only a white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the tense corded muscles beneath. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, and the dark circles beneath his storm-grey eyes betrayed the truth: the sovereign had not slept. In his other hand, he carried the stack of forged treason letters. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Alexander's eyes took in the sight of her. The regal Grand Duchess he had publicly condemned was now covered in soot, her elegant auburn hair slipping from its pins, her emerald gown torn and stained with ash. Yet despite her ruined appearance, she stood as proudly as a conquering queen. "You broke out of a locked confinement room," Alexander said, his voice a dangerous, quiet rumble. "You navigated the forbidden passages. Tell me, Seraphina, did you come to the archives to burn the rest of your treasonous trail?" "I came," Seraphina replied, her voice steady and sharp as glass, "to find the truth you are too terrified to look for." Alexander's jaw clenched. He stepped close to the lantern light, casting harsh shadows across his strong cheekbones. "I have the truth right here in my hand. Letters bearing your signature. A man who confessed to conspiring with you. The council demands your exile by dawn. Some demand your head. And what does the sovereign demand?" She challenged, not stepping back as he loomed over her. "If you are so certain of my guilt, Alexander, why are you pacing the archives in the middle of the night, reading the letters over and over again?" The question struck a nerve. Alexander's eyes flashed with a sudden agonizing vulnerability. The absolute ruler of Valerius was trapped inside his own paranoia. He looked at the letters in his hand, then back to her. Because the actor's confession was too loud, Alexander admitted softly, almost against his will. It was too theatrical. "But the letters are flawless, Seraphina. The seal is perfect. Your signature is exact. I want to believe you, but my crown cannot afford blind faith." He looked down and saw the crimson stain spreading across her white lace glove. His rigid posture broke. "You are bleeding." Instinct overriding protocol, Alexander reached out to take her injured hand. His fingers brushed against her wrist, warm and rough. Seraphina flinched and violently pulled her hand away. Alexander froze, his hand suspended in the empty air between them. "Do not touch me," Seraphina whispered, her voice dropping to an icy, trembling octave. "You called me a burden before the entire court. You allowed a hired rat to humiliate me. You do not get to play the concerned husband in the shadows when you lack the courage to defend me in the light." Alexander looked as if she had struck him. The silver sovereign signet ring on his finger gleamed in the lantern light as he slowly lowered his hand, his expression hardening back into the cold mask of a ruler. "The council convenes in 3 hours," Alexander said, his voice void of emotion now. "Return to your rooms, Seraphina. I will not send the guards to drag you back, but at dawn I must judge you according to the law." "Then judge me," Seraphina said, her chin lifting defiantly. "But when the sun rises, Alexander, make sure you're looking at the right traitor." She turned her back on the sovereign. Clutching her torn dress, she walked back into the suffocating darkness of the ash passage. Against her chest, the blank royal parchment felt like a loaded pistol. The trap was set, and it was time to write a lie that would reveal the truth. The heavy stone panel behind the hearth scraped shut, sealing the freezing draft of the ash passage away. Seraphina leaned against the cold brick, her chest heaving against the rigid boning of her corset. Her lungs burned from the soot, and her muscles trembled from the grueling climb back up to the east wing. But her mind was sharper than it had been all night. She walked over to the small, unlit wash basin in the corner. Pouring a meager splash of freezing water from the pitcher, she hastily scrubbed the dark ash from her face and neck. The water stung the fresh cut on her right palm. She removed her ruined, blood-stained lace glove and tossed it into the empty hearth. There was no time to rest. The sky outside the barred window was bleeding from pitch black into the bruised deep violet of pre-dawn. The council would convene in less than 2 hours. Seraphina moved to the narrow, rickety wooden table beneath the window. She reached into the bodies of her torn emerald gown and withdrew the pristine sheet of royal parchment and the small glass vial of iron gall ink. She found a brittle, forgotten quill resting at the bottom of the table's drawer. It was old, but it would serve her purpose. Seraphina sat down, smoothing the thick parchment flat. She took a slow, steadying breath. She was not writing a defense. She was writing the bait for a trap, and the bait had to be exactly what her enemy was starving for. Isabella of Rinaldi was ambitious, cruel, and incredibly vain. She wanted to see Seraphina broken. She wanted undeniable proof that the Grand Duchess was a fleeing coward. Dipping the quill into the dark ink, Seraphina began to write. She perfectly maintained her own elegant, looping handwriting, the very handwriting the Rinaldi Forge Masters had spent months copying. "To my contact in the Eastern Garrison." She wrote the quill, scratching loudly in the silent room. "The Sovereign remains blind to our true numbers, but the Council moves too quickly. I fear I cannot maintain this charade until winter's end. I will abandon the Winter Palace before the dawn bells ring. Ensure the border gates are open. I bring the remaining gold." It was a masterpiece of manufactured treason. It confirmed every lie Isabella had planted. It painted Alexander as a fool, and Seraphina as a desperate traitor orchestrating a massive conspiracy. She signed it with her full royal title, Seraphina, Grand Duchess of Valerius. She blew softly on the wet ink, watching the dark letters dry into a permanent, damning rust color. Then she deliberately laid the quill down. She did not seal the letter. There was no wax in this room, and she had no signet ring. It was an unsealed, highly treasonous document written on restricted royal parchment. A heavy clank at the iron door made her stiffen. The deadbolt slid back. The heavy door opened just wide enough to let a young, trembling servant boy slip inside. He carried a small wooden tray with a heel of stale bread and a cup of water, the final meal of a condemned prisoner before sentencing. The boy kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards, terrified to look at the disgraced Grand Duchess. He set the tray on the edge of the bed and turned to leave as quickly as possible. "Wait!" Seraphina commanded. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority of the throne. The boy froze, his shoulders hunched in fear. Seraphina stood up. Despite the ash staining her skirt and the torn hem dragging on the floor, she moved with terrifying grace. She reached up to her auburn hair, pulling loose a silver hairpin, tipped with a massive, flawless South Sea pearl. Her heavy hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She stepped in front of the boy, blocking the door. "Look at me," she said gently. The boy slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide with terror. "You serve the East Wing, but I know the maids talk," Seraphina said, keeping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, who pays you for the whispers you sweep from these floors? Is it the head housekeeper? Or is it Baroness Isabella's personal maid?" The boy swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the heavy door. The Baroness's maid, your grace. A silver coin for any news from your room. Seraphina smiled. It was a cold, brilliant smile. She held up the pearl hairpin. In the dim candlelight, the jewel glowed with a fortune that could buy a commoner, a house, and a horse. The boy's eyes went perfectly round. I have a letter, Seraphina whispered, picking up the unsealed parchment from the table. She folded it twice, hiding the contents. I need you to smuggle it out of the palace to the stables. But I am a terrible judge of loyalty, and you are a very clever boy. She pressed the folded letter and the pearl hairpin into his trembling, soot-stained hands. I suspect, Seraphina continued, leaning down so her hazel eyes locked onto his, that instead of taking this to the stables, you might take it directly to Baroness Isabella's maid. You will tell her you caught me trying to smuggle a desperate message out of the palace. You will trade it for a pouch of gold, and you will keep this pearl for yourself. The boy stared at her, completely paralyzed. The Grand Duchess was giving him the letter and openly telling him to betray her. Do we understand each other? Seraphina asked, her voice dropping to a chilling murmur. Yes, your grace, the boy stammered, clutching the parchment and the pearl to his chest. Go, and be quick, the sun is rising. The boy scrambled backward, practically falling out of the room. The guard slammed the door shut, locking the iron deadbolt once more. Seraphina turned back to the window. The first grey light of dawn was bleeding over the jagged peaks of the Valerian mountains. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a cold, freezing mist over the palace grounds. The bait was in the water. Isabella would receive the letter within the hour. She would read the treasonous words. She would see the official royal parchment. But her vanity would demand perfection. To present this to the sovereign, as an intercepted royal dispatch, a formal military order from the Grand Duchess, it needed the official stamp of the crown. Isabella would have no choice. She would heat her red wax. She would take out her flawless counterfeit seal, and she would stamp the letter herself. Seraphina closed her eyes, listening to the distant, deep tolling of the palace bells. The council was gathering. The trap was armed. Now she just had to walk into the jaws of the court and wait for the false queen to snap it shut. In the opulent warmth of the West Wing Baroness, Isabella of Rinaldi sat before her gilded vanity mirror. The air in her chambers was thick with the suffocating scent of jasmine and the heat of a roaring hearth. She brushed her platinum blonde curls with slow, deliberate strokes, waiting for the sun to rise and officially declare her victory over the House of Vance. A frantic knock at her chamber doors broke the morning silence. Her headmaid slipped into the room, gripping the arm of the terrified servant boy from the East Wing. The boy was trembling so violently his teeth chattered, but he held out a folded piece of thick cream-colored paper. My lady! The maid whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. The boy caught the Grand Duchess trying to bribe him. She gave him a pearl hairpin to smuggle this out to the eastern border. Isabella's pale green eyes snapped toward the parchment. She snatched it from the boy's soot-stained hands, unfolding it with eager manicured fingers. As she read the looping, elegant handwriting, a smile stretched across her narrow face. It was a smile of pure, venomous triumph. I will abandon the Winter Palace before the dawn bells ring. I bring the remaining gold. It was perfect. It was the ultimate, undeniable confession. Seraphina was not just a traitor. She was a coward trying to flee like a thief in the night. Give the rat a pouch of silver, and throw him out, Isabella commanded without looking up. The maid dragged the boy away, leaving Isabella alone with the damning document. She walked toward the window, holding the paper up to the pale morning light. The watermark of the Valerian eagle was faintly visible inside the fibers. Royal parchment. Seraphina had somehow stolen the official paper to write her treasonous dispatch. It was a brilliant, desperate move, but as Isabella looked at the bottom of the page, her smile faltered slightly. There was no wax, no seal. To the Sovereign Grand Duke, an unsealed letter was a rumor. A sealed dispatch was a military command. If she presented this as a loose piece of paper, Alexander might question its origin. He might ask how a confined prisoner managed to write it. But if it was sealed, stamped with the royal seal of Valerius, it became an official intercepted decree of treason. It would prove that Seraphina still had loyalists inside the palace, providing her with the crown's tools. Isabella turned back to her vanity. She reached underneath the heavy velvet skirt of the dressing table and pressed a hidden latch. A small wooden drawer popped open. Inside rested a stick of deep blood-red wax from the Eastern merchants, and a heavy breast matrix, the flawless counterfeit seal forged by her family. She lit a small candle on her desk. Holding the red wax over the flame, she watched it melt, the hot drops splattering onto the bottom of Seraphina's letter. The smell of burning wax filled the perfumed room, thick and metallic. Isabella picked up the brass seal. She did not hesitate. She pressed the cold metal hard into the pooling red wax, holding it there for 3 agonizing seconds to ensure the impression was absolute. When she lifted the brass, the Valyrian eagle stared back at her, its talons clutching 3 perfectly smooth arrows. "Checkmate, you pathetic little bird," Isabella whispered, sliding the forged matrix back into its hiding place. Meanwhile, deep inside the Sovereign's council chamber, the air was freezing and tense. Sovereign, Grand Duke Alexander sat at the head of the massive, circular oak table. He had not changed his clothes. The midnight blue velvet coat felt heavier than armor. Around him, the 6 high ministers of the Grand Duchy stood like vultures waiting for a corpse. "The state demands stability, Your Grace!" The High Chancellor urged, his voice dry and unrelenting. "The actor's public confession during the banquet has already spread to the lower city. If you do not punish the Grand Duchess swiftly, the Eastern Lords will view it as weakness. They will rebel before the winter snow melts." Alexander stared at the blank decree of exile resting on the table before him. A silver quill was clutched in his gloved hand. All he had to do was sign his name, press the silver sovereign signet ring into the wax, and Seraphina of House Vance would be stripped of her title and thrown into the frozen wastelands just as her father had been. But his hand would not move. His mind kept flashing back to the midnight archive. He saw the soot on her face. He saw the cold, unbroken pride in her hazel eyes. He remembered the sharp, visceral flinch when he had tried to touch her bleeding hand. "If you are so certain of my guilt, Alexander, why are you pacing the archives in the middle of the night?" He closed his eyes. The headache throbbing at his temples was blinding. He was a sovereign. He could not afford to govern with his heart, not when the evidence was stacked so high against her. But the profound stillness in Seraphina's defiance haunted him. A guilty woman begs. A guilty woman cries. Seraphina had looked at him with the chilling authority of a true queen witnessing a monumental failure. "Your Grace," the Chancellor pressed, leaning forward. "The ink!" Alexander tightened his grip on the quill. He dipped the silver nib into the inkwell. He touched the tip to the parchment. The heavy double doors of the council chamber suddenly swung open. Baronessa Isabella swept into the room, flanked by 2 palace guards. She played the role of the devastated loyal servant to perfection. Her face was pale, her breath quick, holding a sealed document to her chest as if it were a venomous snake. "Forgive the intrusion, Sovereign," Isabella gasped, bowing deeply before the table. "But my maid intercepted a servant fleeing the East Wing. The Grand Duchess. She is trying to escape the palace." Alexander stood up his chair, scraping violently against the stone floor. "What?" Isabella stepped forward and placed the freshly sealed letter onto the oak table. Alexander stared at the deep red wax, the Valyrian eagle staring back at him. With trembling hands, he broke the seal, snapping the wax in half, and unfolded the heavy royal parchment. He read the words, "I will abandon the Winter Palace. I bring the remaining gold." The internal conflict that had been tearing Alexander apart for the past 6 hours died instantly. The agonizing hope that she might be innocent evaporated, replaced by an absolute freezing fury. She had used him. She had used his momentary hesitation in the archives to orchestrate an escape. The silver quill snapped in his fist, dark ink bleeding into his glove. "Captain," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm that made even the High Ministers step back. The captain of the guard stepped forward, bowing. "Bring the Grand Duchess to this chamber immediately," the Sovereign commanded. "Do not let her change her clothes. Bring her in the dirt and the torn silk she was arrested in. Let her face the justice she has written for herself." The iron deadbolt of the East Wing confinement room slid back with a sharp, metallic screech. When the heavy door swung open, the 4 palace guards standing in the corridor tightened their grips on their silver halberds. They expected to find a broken woman weeping on the floor and begging for a delay in her sentencing. Instead, Grand Duchess Seraphina was already standing at the center of the cold room, facing the door. She had not slept. Smudges of dark ash from the secret passage still clung to the edges of her pale neck. Her deep auburn hair, stripped of its silver pins, fell in loose, heavy waves over her shoulders. Her right hand was bare, revealing a raw, horizontal cut across her palm. Yet despite the soot, the blood, and the torn hem of her emerald gown, her posture was terrifyingly absolute. "And the Sovereign Grand Duke demands your presence in the council chamber." The lead guard said, his voice faltering slightly under her intense hazel gaze. "Lead the way," Seraphina replied evenly. The walk from the east wing to the Sovereign's council chamber was a public execution of its own. The morning sun cast long, freezing shadows across the marble floors. Word of her attempted escape had already spread. Dozens of nobles and high-ranking courtiers had gathered along the grand corridors, eager to witness the fall of the House of Vance. They whispered behind gloved hands. They sneered at her ruined silk and the dirt on her skirts. But Seraphina did not lower her chin. She walked with the slow, measured cadence of a ruler inspecting her troops. The torn hem of her emerald gown dragged across the polished stone with a soft, sweeping hiss, a sound that carried the weight of her enduring dignity. When they reached the massive double oak doors of the council chamber, the guards pushed them open. The atmosphere inside was thick enough to choke on. The 6 high ministers of the Grand Duchy stood around the circular oak table, their faces set in grim judgment. Standing slightly behind them, wrapped in her pristine white fur shawl, was Baroness Isabella of Rinaldi. Her pale green eyes practically glowed with suppressed vicious triumph. But Seraphina's gaze locked immediately onto the man standing at the head of the table. Sovereign Grand Duke Alexander Valerius looked like a storm contained within a human body. He was leaning forward, his gloved hands braced heavily against the oak table. The midnight blue velvet of his coat absorbed the dim morning light, making him appear as cold and unyielding as the palace walls. The agonizing vulnerability she had seen in his eyes in the Midnight Archive was gone. It had been replaced by a furious absolute conviction. Between his hands, resting on the center of the table, was the letter. The heavy red wax seal had been snapped in two. "Halt!" The captain of the guard commanded, stopping Seraphina at the edge of the circular table. Alexander stared at her. He saw the cut on her bare hand. He saw the ash on her skin. His jaw locked so tightly that the bone threatened to crack. He had almost let his heart overrule his crown. Down in the dark of the archives, he had almost believed her. The betrayal stung worse than a blade. "You told me to look for the truth, Seraphina," Alexander said. His voice was dangerously quiet, vibrating with a suppressed rage that made the high ministers hold their breath. "You told me to make sure I was looking at the right traitor when the sun rose." He picked up the piece of royal parchment and threw it across the smooth oak table. It slid to a stop inches from her bleeding hand. "Is this the truth you are hiding?" Alexander demanded, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the stone walls. "A dispatch to your contact at the border. A confession that you were trying to flee the Winter Palace with stolen gold before the council could sentence you." Seraphina looked down at the letter. There it was, her own elegant handwriting outlining a massive treasonous conspiracy. And at the bottom, exactly where she had known it would be, was the deep red wax seal bearing the Valerian eagle. She slowly raised her eyes to Isabella. The Baroness was watching her with the smug, self-satisfied look of a predator watching a trapped rabbit struggle. "You have nothing to say, Grand Duchess?" Isabella asked, stepping forward with an air of theatrical sorrow. The boy confessed. "He said you gave him a pearl hairpin to smuggle this out of the palace. To think you used the Sovereign's mercy in allowing you to keep your jewels to fund your escape." "A brilliant narrative, Baroness." Seraphina said, her voice smooth and unbothered. She turned her attention back to Alexander. "Before the council passes its final judgment, I must ask one question to the woman who intercepted this damning evidence." The High Chancellor slammed his fist on the table. "You have no right to question anyone. The evidence is absolute." "Let us speak!" Alexander commanded sharply, raising his hand. He stared at Seraphina, his storm grey eyes narrowing. "Let her ask her question. It will change nothing." Seraphina did not touch the letter. She stood perfectly still. "Baroness Isabella, you claim your maid intercepted this letter from the servant boy I allegedly bribed. Is that correct?" "It is," Isabella replied smoothly, lifting her chin. "And when you received this letter..." Seraphina continued, her hazel eyes locking onto Isabella with an unblinking predatory focus. "Was it exactly as it appears now, I ask? because the chain of evidence is vital in a trial of high treason. Isabella scoffed a delicate mocking sound. Are you implying I tampered with it? I brought it directly to the sovereign the moment it was placed in my hands. The wax was still warm when my maid took it from the boy. So to be absolutely clear before the sovereign and the high ministers, Seraphina pressed her voice echoing clearly in the silent chamber. When the boy handed over this letter, the red wax seal of the Grand Duchy was already stamped at the bottom of the page. The seal was unbroken. Isabella smiled. It was the fatal, arrogant smile of a woman who thought she had won everything. Yes, Grand Duchess, Isabella declared loudly, ensuring every man in the room heard her. The letter was perfectly sealed, stamped with the royal wax. You condemned yourself the moment you pressed the seal into the parchment. Seraphina closed her eyes for a single heartbeat. The tension in her shoulders melted away. The heavy, constricting corset felt completely weightless. She opened her eyes, and the chilling authority of the true sovereign Grand Duchess flooded the room. Thank you, Isabella, Seraphina whispered. She finally reached out her bleeding hand, picking up the broken red wax from the table. Because that is a physical impossibility. The absolute certainty in Seraphina's voice sent a sudden icy ripple through the council chamber. Baroness Isabella's confident smile faltered. The high ministers shifted uneasily, glancing between the disgraced Grand Duchess and the sovereign. Alexander did not move, but his storm-grey eyes locked onto Seraphina's bleeding hand as she held up the broken piece of red wax. A physical impossibility, the High Chancellor scoffed, breaking the silence. You wrote a treasonous escape order, Grand Duchess. We are looking at it. I did write it, Chancellor, Seraphina admitted smoothly. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Alexander's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white against the oak table. I wrote it 2 hours ago in the East Wing confinement room. Seraphina continued, her voice projecting clearly over the murmurs. She turned her hazel eyes to Alexander. When you found me in the Midnight Archive. Alexander, I was not trying to burn my trail. I had already taken a blank sheet of royal parchment and a vial of iron gall ink from the High Archivist's desk. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. The blank parchment. She had been hiding it against her chest when he almost touched her. I wrote exactly what the Baroness wanted to read, Seraphina said, turning her sharp gaze back to Isabella. A desperate confession, a plea for a border escape, and then I gave it to the servant boy who brings the morning water. I gave it to him, unsealed, folded twice with no wax, no ribbon, and certainly no royal seal. Isabella's face drained of color. The pristine white fur shawl around her shoulders suddenly looked like a shroud. Lies! Isabella shrieked, her composure cracking. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Seraphina. She is spinning riddles. The boy handed it to my maid perfectly sealed. Did he? Seraphina asked, taking a slow step toward the table. Her torn emerald hem swept across the stone. The East Wing confinement room has no hearth fires, Isabella. It has no candles thick enough to provide a pool of wax, let alone the specialized red wax of the Eastern merchants. And most importantly, I was stripped of my signet ring upon my arrest. Seraphina placed the broken piece of wax down on the table right under Alexander's gaze. If I handed the letter to the boy without a seal and you just testified before the sovereign and the High Council that the letter arrived in your hands fully sealed. Seraphina's voice dropped to a lethal, chilling whisper. Then who applied the royal wax, Isabella? The council chamber went deathly quiet. The high ministers stared at Isabella. The Baroness took a step backward, her breath hitching in her throat. Her pale green eyes darted frantically around the room looking for an ally, but the men who had favored her moments ago were now backing away. She is lying! Isabella cried out, her voice shrill. She must have had an accomplice. She is trying to confuse you. Your Grace, look at the seal. It is the true Valyrian eagle. It proves her guilt. It proves yours, Seraphina corrected effortlessly. She looked at her husband. Alexander, look at the eagle on that wax. Look closely at the left talon. Alexander looked down. His chest was rising and falling with heavy, controlled breaths. He stared at the red wax impression. The eagle clutches 3 arrows, Seraphina recited, echoing the words from her father's hidden journal. On the seal, Isabella just provided those 3 arrows are perfectly smooth. A flawless, beautiful piece of craftsmanship. But it is counterfeit. Alexander slowly raised his left hand. The silver sovereign signet ring rested on his index finger, the master matrix used to cast every official seal in the Grand Duchy. The first sovereign of Valerius knew that traitors would one day try to forge his authority. Seraphina said the absolute command in her voice, filling the vast chamber. He struck the master mold with a jeweler's chisel. The middle arrow in the eagle's talon has a microscopic jagged nick at its base, a deliberate flaw designed to outlive perfection. Alexander pulled off his heavy leather glove. He brought the massive silver ring close to his face, tilting it toward the pale morning light, streaming through the high windows. He stared at the matrix. There at the base of the middle arrow was the tiny jagged nick. He immediately grabbed the broken red wax from the table. He brought it up to the light, his storm grey eyes scanning the impression with ruthless intensity. The arrows on the wax were perfectly flawlessly smooth. The silence in the room was absolute. The sound of Alexander lowering his hand echoed like a thunderclap. The Sovereign Grand Duke slowly lifted his head and looked at Isabella. The vulnerability, the hesitation, the agonizing doubt, all of it was gone. What remained was the terrifying, unrestrained wrath of an absolute ruler who realized his throne had been manipulated and his innocent wife had been publicly tortured for it. "You forged the crown," Alexander whispered. The words were quiet, but they struck Isabella with the force of a physical blow. Her knees buckled slightly. "Alexander, please!" You forged the crown." Alexander repeated, his voice vibrating with a lethal, seismic fury. He picked up the stack of treason letters from the banquet, the ones he had thrown at Seraphina's feet just hours ago. He snapped the seals off one by one, examining them under the light. Smooth, smooth, smooth. Every single letter that had condemned Seraphina was stamped with the same flawless counterfeit seal. "You orchestrated the actor at the banquet!" Alexander said, stepping around the massive oak table, moving toward Isabella like a predator circling a trapped animal. "You ordered the forgery of my family's crest. You sought to use my own laws to execute my wife so that you might steal her place." Isabella fell to her knees on the cold stone floor. The white fur shawl slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her like dirty snow. "Your Grace, I only wanted to protect you. Her father was a traitor. She is a Vance. She is the Grand Duchess of Valerius." Alexander roared, his voice shaking the very glass in the windows. "And you are nothing but a thief in silk." The echo of Alexander's wrath seemed to shake the dust from the stone-vaulted ceiling of the council chamber. Baroness Isabella of Rinaldi, the woman who had spent months meticulously crafting the destruction of the Grand Duchess, was reduced to a trembling, weeping heap on the floor. Her manicured hands clawed at the heavy oak legs of the council table, but there was no salvation to be found in the wood. "Alexander, I beg you!" Isabella sobbed, her pristine platinum curls unraveling around her tear-streaked face. "I did it for the Grand Duchy. The Vances are a stain on this court. I was only trying to give you the perfect reign you deserve. You tried to build a reign on forged wax and innocent blood." Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, unforgiving rumble. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her with the cold, absolute disgust of a sovereign who had just realized there was a viper sleeping on his throne. He turned his storm-grey eyes to the captain of the guard. "Strip her of the Rinaldi titles." Alexander commanded, the words echoing like a death knell in the silent chamber. "Take her to the deep dungeons beneath the Midnight Archive. Seize all correspondence from her estate. Arrest her accomplices and lock down the eastern gates. She will face the high tribunal for treason against the crown." "No, you cannot do this. I am a baroness. I am—" Isabella's hysterical screams were cut short as the two armored guards hauled her to her feet. The very same guards who had roughly grabbed Seraphina's arm hours ago now dragged the thrashing false queen out of the chamber. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sound of her frantic weeping. The council chamber was plunged into a suffocating silence. The 6 high ministers stood frozen around the table. The men who had loudly demanded Seraphina's exile mere minutes ago now looked pale, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The High Chancellor, trembling slightly, took a tentative step forward. "Your Grace," he stammered, his dry voice lacking its usual authority. The forgery. It was incredibly sophisticated. The Rinaldi forge masters are infamous. We could not possibly have known the evidence was manufactured. Alexander turned his head slowly. He looked at the Chancellor, then at the other ministers. You could not have known. Alexander repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. You, the highest minds of Valerius. You saw a perfect seal and immediately demanded my wife's head. But the woman you called a traitor, the woman you locked in a freezing room without a fire, saw the truth that blinded you all. The Chancellor swallowed hard, stepping backward. Alexander looked down at his gloved hand. The silver sovereign signet ring gleamed in the morning light. The ink from the snapped quill still stained his fingertips. He had been seconds away from signing her exile. He had been seconds away from destroying the only person in the palace who had actually protected his throne. Slowly, the sovereign, Grand Duke, turned to face Seraphina. She was standing exactly where she had been when she laid the trap. The morning light filtering through the high windows illuminated the dark ash on her neck, the loose, heavy waves of her auburn hair, and the torn, ruined hem of her emerald gown. Her right hand was still bare, the horizontal cut across her palm, steadily dripping a single drop of dark blood onto the polished stone floor. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved. She simply looked tired yet fundamentally unbreakable. The memory of the great banquet hall violently pierced Alexander's chest. He remembered standing on his marble steps looking down at her. He remembered throwing the forged letters at her feet. He remembered the cruel, devastating words he had spoken to her in front of 200 mocking nobles. You are a burden to this crown. A crushing, agonizing wave of royal accountability crashed over him. He was a sovereign who prided himself on logic, justice, and protection. Yet he had allowed his paranoia to turn him into a tyrant against his own wife. Alexander closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches from her, the massive height difference forcing him to look down into her calm hazel eyes. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his midnight blue velvet coat and withdrew a clean white silk handkerchief. He gently took her bare right hand. This time, Seraphina did not pull away, but her posture remained rigid, her guard completely up. Alexander wrapped the silk carefully around the cut on her palm, stanching the blood. His large, warm hands trembled slightly against her cold, trembling fingers. You asked me to make sure I was looking at the right traitor when the sun rose. Alexander said, his voice thick with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. I was blind, Seraphina. I was a fool, blinded by my own fears. You are the sovereign, Seraphina replied quietly, her voice devoid of malice, but equally devoid of warmth. You cannot afford to be blind. I know. Alexander tied the silk knot holding her hand for a second longer than necessary before letting go. You saved my crown today. You saved the Grand Duchy from a conspiracy that would have bled us dry. I did not do it for your crown, Alexander. Seraphina stated, her chin lifting slightly. I did it for my own dignity. I refused to let the history books write that Avance died a coward. Your throne simply benefited from my survival. The cold honesty of her words stung, but Alexander knew he deserved nothing less. A private apology in a closed room could not erase the public humiliation she had endured. He had broken her trust before the entire kingdom. He could not mend it in the shadows. Alexander turned sharply away from her, facing the High Chancellor and the pale ministers. Chancellor, Alexander commanded, the absolute authority returning to his voice harder and sharper than before. Send the heralds. Ring the high bells. The Chancellor blinked in confusion. Your Grace. The treason trial is concluded. The Baroness is arrested. What are we ringing the bells for? We are not concluding a trial, Alexander said, his storm-grey eyes flashing with a fierce, uncompromising light. He looked back at his wife, standing tall in her torn dress. We are correcting a sovereign's mistake. Summon every noble, every lord, and every minister who stood in the great banquet hall last night. Have them assemble at the marble throne steps immediately. The Chancellor bowed deeply. Yes, your Grace. But what shall I tell them? Is the occasion... Tell them. Alexander said, turning his body completely toward Seraphina, that the Grand Duchess is taking her rightful place, and they are going to learn how to bow to her. The high bells of the Winter Palace tolled with a deep, resonant thunder that shook the frosted glass windows. It was a sound reserved only for coronations, declarations of war, or the death of a sovereign. Within an hour, The great banquet hall was flooded with the very same nobles who had stood there the night before. They hurried in their faces pale, whispering frantic rumors. Some believed the Grand Duchess had been executed. Others heard whispers of the Baroness, Isabella, being dragged to the dungeons in chains. They gathered at the base of the marble throne steps, the exact location where Seraphina had been publicly destroyed. The massive crystal chandeliers burned fiercely above them, casting stark morning light across the cold stone. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The room fell into a terrified, breathless silence. Sovereign Grand Duke Alexander walked in. He did not wear his crown, but the sheer, lethal authority radiating from his stride made every noble step back parting like the sea before a storm. But it was the woman walking beside him that made the court gasp. Grand Duchess Seraphina had not changed. She still wore the heavy emerald state gown. The torn silk hem swept across the marble floor. Smudges of dark ash stained her pale neck and the edges of her bodice. Her auburn hair hung loose, and her right hand was wrapped in the sovereign's own white silk handkerchief, a single drop of crimson bleeding through the fabric. She looked like a woman who had walked through hell, but as she moved toward the throne, her posture was so magnificently absolute, so undeniably regal, that the glittering nobles in their pristine silks suddenly looked small and foolish. Alexander stopped at the top of the marble steps. He did not sit on his throne. He turned to face his court, the silver sovereign signet ring flashing on his hand. Last night, Alexander's voice boomed, carrying effortlessly to the furthest corners of the vast hall. You stood in this room and watched the Grand Duchess of Valerius be accused of high treason. You watched her be humiliated. You whispered about the tainted blood of the House of Vance. The nobles lowered their heads, trembling. The letters presented last night were forgeries. Alexander declared, holding up the snapped brass matrix of the counterfeit seal. He threw it down the marble steps. It clattered violently against the stone, stopping at the boots of the High Chancellor. Manufactured by Baroness Isabella of Rinaldi to steal a crown that was never hers. The Baroness is currently in the deep dungeons. She will face the executioner's block before the week is out. A collective shuddering breath swept through the crowd. But the Baroness's treason is not the reason I summoned you here. Alexander continued, his voice dropping, shedding its wrath and adopting a profound, heavy gravity. He turned his body completely away from the court and faced Seraphina. The silence was so absolute that the sound of the winter wind outside seemed deafening. Last night, on these very steps, Alexander said, speaking loud enough for the entire kingdom to hear, but looking only into her hazel eyes. I stood before you, blinded by my own paranoia. I threw forged lies at your feet, and I called you a burden to this crown. Seraphina did not blink. She held his gaze, her breath steady beneath her tight corset, waiting for the sovereign to finish carving out his own pride. I was wrong, Alexander stated. The words were not rushed. They were deliberate, heavy with truth. When the council demanded your exile, when the guards locked you in the dark, you did not weep. You broke into the Midnight Archive. You found the flaw in the forgery. You built a trap from nothing but ink and ash, and you caught the traitor who was poised to bleed this Grand Duchy dry. He took a step down. Then Sovereign Grand Duke Alexander, of Valerius, the absolute ruler of the realm, a man who bowed to no king and no god, bent his leg and dropped to one knee on the cold marble floor. The entire court let out a stunned, suffocated gasp. Several ladies covered their mouths in sheer shock. The sovereign did not kneel. Never. Alexander reached out and gently took Seraphina's injured right hand, the one wrapped in his blood-stained silk handkerchief. He bowed his dark head and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to the back of her hand. You are not a burden, Seraphina! Alexander whispered, his storm-grey eyes looking up at her, entirely stripped of their defenses. You are the sword that defends this throne. You are the only true sovereign this court deserves. I ask for your forgiveness, not as your ruler, but as a man who does not wish to rule a single day without you. Seraphina looked down at the powerful man kneeling at her feet. The anger that had kept her spine straight through the freezing night slowly began to melt. She had not won with magic. She had not been saved by a miracle. She had forced the truth into the light, and in doing so she had forced her husband to see her not as a political treaty, not as a traitor's daughter, but as his equal. She gently squeezed his hand. I accept your apology, Alexander. Seraphina said, her voice clear, elegant, and resonant. "And I accept my crown. Not as a gift, and not as a pardon, but as my right." She pulled gently on his hand. "Rise, my sovereign." Alexander stood, his eyes locked onto hers, a flicker of profound awe, and budding genuine love warming the cold grey of his gaze. He stepped back up to her side, turning with her to face the court. "Bow to your Grand Duchess," Alexander commanded, his voice shaking the chandeliers. It happened like a falling wave. The High Chancellor dropped to his knees. The Captain of the Guard followed. Then the lords, the ladies, and the ministers. The rustle of expensive silks and heavy velvets hitting the marble floor filled the great banquet hall, until every single person was kneeling in absolute submission. Seraphina stood at the top of the stairs, her torn emerald hem resting proudly on the stone. The winter sun broke through the heavy clouds outside, casting a brilliant beam of light through the glass, catching the silver embroidery of Alexander's coat, and illuminating the blood and ash on the true queen of Valerius. The Duke had called her a burden in the dark, but in the morning light she was the only power the kingdom could follow. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, or which moment proved she was the true queen. Do you believe a crown belongs to bloodline to justice, or to the woman brave enough to stand before the court? And if you want more emotional royal stories of betrayal, truth, and queens rising again, please subscribe and stay with us for the next story.